So far, in this series, we have gone over idealism in comparison to its rivals. We will now be more focused on what the basic ontology of idealism is. As mentioned before, ontology is the nature of what things are, and under idealism, consciousness or experience is the only thing that exists. However, we cannot understand what the basic ontology of idealism is without first understanding what consciousness actually is. So in this video, I'm going to try my best to define consciousness. Let's begin. First, defining consciousness is not easy. In order to understand consciousness, we must first understand what consciousness is not. First, consciousness is not simply just the awareness of our surroundings. You can be driving, or walking, or doing other autonomous tasks without actually being aware of anything. This happens a lot, especially if we are focused on one task and not our immediate surroundings. Secondly, consciousness is to not be confused with personal identity, or simply just a self-aware mind. Someone's thoughts, emotions, personality, and ego is the felt sense of a personal self that arises in association from introspection. However, the ego or the personal self-aware mind is not identical to consciousness. To understand this, I shall propose this definition of consciousness. Consciousness is mental activity in and of itself. Mental activity is conscious if and only if there is anything it is like to have such mental activity in and of itself. Another definition we can put forth would be this. Mental activity is conscious if there is something it feels like to have such mental activity in and of itself. The words to feel, however, is not clear enough to be used as a solid definition. So philosophers of mind typically define consciousness as anything it is like to have such mental activity in and of itself. You only consider yourself conscious right now because there's something it is like to be you. To get a better understanding, let's say that mental activity corresponds to experience if and only if it is conscious. You experience watching this video because you are conscious of this video right now. If you are not conscious of this video, then there is no way that we can say that you experience it. So, the best way to understand consciousness is that consciousness is simply identical to experience. In fact, if you take a second to think about your own experience, you cannot contain it in one thought, because you're currently experiencing what it is like to experience. Or, another way to put it is that you are currently conscious of what it is like to be conscious. We can directly know that we are conscious, and we can directly know that we have experience. However, in order to have direct knowledge of experience, we must be experiencing our experiences. And so experience, or consciousness, would extend beyond what we can directly know. With this in place then, we can fully understand why defining consciousness as simply just a self-aware mind is not sufficient as a definition. Trying to identify consciousness with a self-aware mind leads to self-reference problems. A self-aware mind would then be what I would call metacognition. Metacognition is the ability to know about experience, and it's the ability to think about one's own thinking. However, experience is not identical to metacognition. A self-aware mind is self-aware because it metacognitively has knowledge of its own experiences, but yet its experience would extend beyond what it is metacognitively aware of. As Donald Hoffman says, no conscious agent can describe itself completely. The very attempt adds more experiences to the agent, which multiplies the complexity of its decisions and actions in light of those new experiences, which requires yet more experiences to capture those more complex decisions and actions, and so on in a vicious loop of incompleteness. A conscious agent, therefore, remains, at least in part, unconscious to itself. Recall that what conscious realism claims to be fundamental is not just conscious experiences, but conscious agents. An agent cannot experience itself in its entirety, no matter how large its repertoire of experiences. Now, since we understand that consciousness cannot be defined as simply a self-aware mind, then we have to make an important distinction. First, there must be a link between the self-aware mind, or the ego, and the experience. Metacognition would allow one to have direct knowledge of one's own consciousness. And so metacognition, or a self-aware mind, would gain conscious knowledge of experience. However, conscious knowledge of the experience would come in addition to the experience itself. So, the important distinction to be made is the distinction between self-reflexive consciousness and consciousness proper. Self-reflexive consciousness is the conscious knowledge of experience, whereas consciousness proper is simply experience in and of itself. Each of us has self-reflexive consciousness. However, we do not have full knowledge of consciousness proper. So, we cannot be self-aware of all our experiences, as that would lead to the self-reference problems that we explained earlier. Mental activity does not need to be metacognitively known in order to be experienced. In fact, most of our ordinary dreams we simply experience without consciously knowing that we experience. Or, as Bernardo Kastrup says, more formally, suppose that one has an experience X. To gain introspective access to X, one must have conscious knowledge of N of X. But N, the conscious knowledge, is a separate experience in its own right. One experience is the known of X as the quality closely related to, but distinct from X itself. Another example is consider breathing. We all have the experience of breathing even if it is not always in our attention or direct awareness. In fact, having conscious knowledge of experience would give one an extra quality of knowing that the sensations were experienced. And so consciousness or experience would extend beyond our own direct awareness. It is outside the field of self-reflection. So, conscious knowledge is something additional that is being added to the total experience. But experience simpliciter is more basic and fundamental. Now, some may try to say that the distinction between experience and self-reflection is merely semantics. However, by conflating consciousness proper with self-reflexive consciousness, we also indirectly equate non-self-reflexive consciousness with unconsciousness. And so, we would absurdly imply that dreams, which largely lack self-reflexive awareness, are not experienced. This line of thinking, of course, is absurd, which is why we should make this important distinction between consciousness proper and self-reflexive consciousness. Finally, because of this distinction, we can understand that consciousness, most of the time, is outside our control and knowledge. Most of our own thoughts we lack control over. If I tell you to think about a red car, you will think about it. Most of our own experiences we lack volitional control over. The closest we can get is a lucid dream. However, even a lucid dream cannot be fully controlled by us. Rather, it is simply just experience happening, and we will always have limited knowledge of that experience. So consciousness, in and of itself, is not restricted to volition or direct awareness. With all this in mind, we can understand a few important things. First, consciousness is not simply just direct awareness. Direct awareness can include many different things, such as our awareness of our immediate environment, as well as the awareness of our own thoughts. However, direct awareness and metacognition are not identical to consciousness, as consciousness would extend beyond what we can know. When you think about consciousness, you are conscious of your own consciousness. When we understand this important point, we can further understand that a self-aware mind is not identical to consciousness, as this would lead to self-reference problems. So, consciousness is not metacognition or direct awareness, which means that it cannot be just a self-aware mind. The second important thing we need to understand is that consciousness is autonomous. We do not have control over our own experiences or even our own thoughts. It is simply flowing like a river. And finally, we cannot stop having experience. If you go to sleep and don't remember a dream, it is most likely the case that you had a dream, but that you simply don't remember. Or, if you are knocked out and become unconscious, in the sense of not being aware of your immediate environment, you may still be having non-self-reflexive experiences. So, with all this in mind, we can see that consciousness is simply just experience. And experience is something that is largely non-self-reflexive and outside our control for the most part. Having experiences means that you have mental activity in and of itself, regardless of whether or not you are or are currently directly aware of it. One's self-awareness would come in addition to the more basic experience one is always having. But experience simpliciter is always going to be there, even if we are not aware of it. And that is the basic ontology of idealism. The ontology is that experience simpliciter is the only thing that exists, and that we can never escape such a construct. That experience is the ultimate nature of reality. In the next video, we shall start to investigate the various forms of idealism. We shall start by looking at the distinction between monistic idealism and pluralistic idealism.